Welcome to the Psychology Podcast, where we give you insights into the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity. I'm Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman, and in each episode I have a conversation with a guest who will stimulate your mind and give you a greater understanding of yourself, others, and the world we live in. Hopefully we'll also provide a glimpse into human possibility. Thanks for listening and enjoy the podcast. Today, it's a great honor to have Dr. Robert Plomin on the podcast. Dr. Plomin is Professor of Behavioural Genetics at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience at King's College London. He previously held positions at the University of Colorado Boulder and Pennsylvania State University. He was elected a Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences and of the British Academy for his twin studies and his groundbreaking work in behavioral genetics. He's the author or co-author of many books, including G is for Genes, The Impact of Genetics on Education and Achievement with Kathryn Asbury, and most recently, Blueprint, How DNA Makes Us Who We Are. Robert, so great to chat with you today.
Thanks. I look forward to it.
Yeah, it's an honor. I mean, your research was foundational for my studies in the field of human intelligence, and you're one of the top, should we say founders of the field of behavioral genetics? Would you consider yourself a founder of that discipline?
No, I mean, most people consider the founding like Scott and Fuller's book in 1960. So I was part of the second generation, I think. The first generation were people like John DeFries and people who came out of agricultural genetics and really animal husbandry. Whereas I was, a real psychologist. I was trained as a psychologist and I got into behavioral genetics just by chance because I went to the University of Texas at Austin, where they had the first behavioral genetics program. I don't know if you know that story about Gardner Lindsay.
No, tell me the story.
Past president of the APA. And for his presidential address, he gave a talk about sort of genetics and evolutionary stuff. But he did the early work in the 50s with inbred strains of mice and kind of looking at genetics with Marty Mansovitz. So with the Sputnik era, Texas tried to recruit him from Harvard, Gardner Lindsay. And they said, we'll give you whatever you want. And he says, right, well, I'd like to have the first program in behavioral genetics at the University of Texas at Austin. And he could hire anybody he wanted. So he hired just about everybody in the world who was doing it then. This is in the late 60s. People like Jan Buell, who studied fruit flies, Del Thiessen, who studied mice. There was only about a dozen people in the world, and he got about 6 of them or so. So it was really amazing. And I went to graduate school at Texas, not because of that program. I didn't even know about it. But, they had one of those, I don't know if graduate programs in the U.S. still do this, but they had a set of core courses.
They do.
In the first 2 years, really.
Unfortunately, they do.
School. They do?
Unfortunately.
And I think they were good in a way because they made everybody take the same courses: clinical, perception, learning, personality. And at Texas, uniquely, behavioral genetics, taught by all these phenomenal people, not just Gardner Lindsay, but John Lowland. I certainly should have mentioned him. All those guys, they just taught some lectures on this course. And so I had to take this course, and 40 students in the class, and it completely blew me away. Yet 39 other people, didn't hit them at all. And I often wonder, what is it why did it affect me and not anyone else? And I really don't know the answer to that.
Isn't the answer your DNA? Isn't the answer obvious based on your research? No, I'm extraordinarily interested in individual differences. My whole life, I've always wondered, why am I so interested in individual differences? I've wondered that. Now, I'm interested in all of the causal factors that predict individual, but I have always been, I remember, being 5-6 years old and on the playground and just massively curious. Why is that person able to go in that jungle gym and swing on it? Or like, I can't, when I try, I fall and I, get hurt.
Yeah.
Very bad. And I was really curious about that at age 5. So yeah, I wonder if there is a genetic contribution or influence to the extent to which you're interested in studying the science of individual differences.
Isn't it lucky, though, that, you kind of find out what you like to do?
Yeah.
Because I think you only do well at what you like to do. I mean, we could probably do okay at a lot of different things.
Yeah.
Including just making money, in business or something. But it's really a tremendous joy in life to find something you really love. even though when I talk to people about it, very few people really, like you and me, they really don't know why it is they like what they like, but you know that you do.
Well, yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I actually just came across a study about 5 minutes before I had this conversation with you. So this is actually really good timing. This study showing that like the single best predictor of productivity, you know how everyone has all these like ideas for what is productivity or what causes productivity. The single best predictor of productivity was just simply how much fun do you consider the task? There's all these other proposed hypotheses and, ideas and productivity hacks, which I'm putting in quotes, the word hacks in quotes, maybe at the end of the day, that is important. And that does seem to relate to a central thesis of your new book, of going with the grain, not against the grain of your nature. And that seems to be a core theme of your book. And I'd love if you could outline for our listeners a little bit how you arrived at this conclusion, some of the research you went through. I mean, you've had a career of 45 years, and you said that you've been wanting to write this book for 30 years. So my first question is, that first 15 years, what happened there, that transformed you to then, after the 15th year, you decided, wow, I really kind of want to write a book about this. And then if you could just go through some of the seminal studies that you conducted. After that, after you lay that out, then we'll go through the 5 major discoveries. But first, if you don't mind, just tell me a little bit about the methodology.
Well, yeah, as I say, in the second year of graduate school at the University of Texas at Austin, I was exposed to this core course in behavioral genetics. And I just knew at that point that's what I wanted to do. And I still don't know why, but I really did. I mean, I hadn't had genetics before. I guess part of it was maybe personality. At that time, I was everything undergraduate. I was just taking undergraduate courses that fit in with my work schedule. I was working full time while I was in university. And I was in film, in English, and then a long time in philosophy. But then I had this magic moment in philosophy where I was at DePaul University in Chicago, and they were into phenomenology. So for the third time, I was hearing about deskness. Do you know the idea of phenomenology? And I kept getting in trouble in philosophy because I kept saying, well, how do we know what this guy argues is any better than what this guy argues? Yeah. And I kept trying to come up with testable hypotheses. And I was kind of stonewalled on it. And then I just had the realization that if you can test it, it's no longer philosophy and it's psychology. So I just walked out of class and that was it. I became a psych major, which, in the States you can do. You can change your major, as I did 4 or 5 times. But that was really kind of an important moment in my life, realizing that I'm just kind of an empiricist. I just want data to solve problems. I don't want to just argue about things. Then I happened to go to the University of Texas at Austin, and they were, I knew that's what I wanted to do. And so I got involved a little bit with John Lowland and Joe Horn, who were working on the Texas Adoption Project at that point. But my supervisor was Arnie Buss, who is one of those guys who, if they weren't so smart, they'd be locked up. We had some incredibly difficult times. I grew up in a family where it was impolite to argue, whereas Arnie Buss would start conversations like, God, I didn't know you were so stupid. I mean, how could you say something like that?
Was that David Buss's father?
It is indeed.
Wow.
And David Buss got the brunt of that too. I could tell you some stories there as well. But Arnie, it's sort of like the Marines. You're not sorry you did it, but you wouldn't do it again, maybe, But it was a very important, I learned to be tough, and I could give as well as I got, even in sort of bare knuckles verbal fights, So that was a good experience. And so Arnie was into personality at that time, Arnie Buss. He wrote books on aggression and that sort of thing. And so I was doing work in personality, and I thought what would be cool is to study what at that time was called temperament, was trying to find the more genetic aspects of personality. And so I did my dissertation on that, a twin and family study, that sort of thing. And so for quite a while there, I did work on personality, including observational twin studies, where we go into the home. So the new thing was, I thought, let's not just do self-report. How about parent ratings? How about observers going in the home and looking at kids, getting different. I was just worried that everything in personality seemed to be heritable. And maybe that's a self-report sort of bias, I thought. This is back in the early 70s. So then I did observational studies in the families with David Rowe, who was my first student when I was at the University of Colorado. That was kind of cool. He was in his second year and he was in social psychology. And when I gave an initial talk on behavioral genetics, he had that same experience where he said, I'm not doing social psychology. I want to do that. Individual differences, genetics, that sort of thing. So I became his sort of shadow supervisor, and we did work together, and that was great. David did a lot of important early work, David Rowe.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know him? Do you know of his name?
I do know of his name, yes.
Yeah.
I've seen him as a co-author on various papers.
Yeah. He died, pancreatic cancer. It seems like my best friends seem to die of that. David Folker also died of pancreatic cancer. So anyway, that was all great in terms of getting going. But then I decided personality measures, even parent reports, observer reports, the measures just aren't as well conditioned as cognitive abilities. So that's when I just kind of made a conscious decision to get into cognitive abilities. And I began the Colorado Adoption Project, which is a study of 250 adoptive families and 250 matched non-adoptive families, where I had tested the biological mothers of those adopted kids myself when I first got to Colorado. Tell me if I'm jumbling the story too much, but I was in University of Texas, 70 to 74, got my PhD. I was going to stay there. They were even thinking of hiring me as an assistant professor. But then, as an example of non-shared kind of random environmental influences, someone at Colorado at the Institute for Behavioural Genetics committed suicide in June. So John Lowland got a call from Jerry McLaren in Austin. Jerry McLaren founded the Institute for Behavioural Genetics. And Jerry asked John if they had anyone who could fill this slot. And so John said, oh yeah, we've got this guy, Robert Plomin. He'd be great. Done deal. They just said, well, why don't you come and visit? But, it wasn't like today. I mean, there was no advertisement. There was no anything. So, it was the ideal job for me. It was a joint appointment in psychology and at the Institute of Behavioral Genetics. And, it was phenomenal. That was the only institute for behavioral genetics then in 1974. So I decided I'd do something different, having seen the Texas Adoption Project and realizing that since the 40s and 50s, there really weren't many adoption studies. There were a lot of twin studies. So I thought it would be good to use this very different design of the adoption study to study behavioral development. And that's what the Colorado Adoption Project was about. So it took 3 tries to get an NIH grant, because back then it was not a cool thing in psychology to be studying genetics. Students nowadays find it hard to believe that it was dangerous professionally and even personally to study genetics in psychology.
Well, I just want to pause a second to reflect. It seems like things are actually reversed. It seems it's not terribly cool if you're an environmental researcher these days.
Yeah, but I always say that genetics provides the best evidence of the importance of the environment. It's just, it's very difficult to find out what those environmental factors are.
Oh, we'll get to that. No, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you describe a little bit the specific methodology that based some of your conclusions in the book on, in the sense, like, treat our audience, some of our audience listeners is not, a lot of them are not psychologists, right? So when we talk about the twin methodology, could you just, like, the twin separated at birth sort of paradigm, could you describe the paradigm a little bit?
Okay, yeah. No, I assume that people following you would be more...
but not all of them necessarily.
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, yeah, when you say twins, people think of the twins reared apart. Did you see this film that's come out? It's about to come out in the UK, 3 Identical Strangers?
No.
It was released in the States in June, I understand. It won a special award from Sundance, the Sundance Film Festival. But, it's a story of those twins separated by the psychiatrist Neubauer in New York. And, these are the Eddie, and they were identical triplets separated in the same adoption agency in New York. And, they got together because one of them went to university in upstate New York, and everybody kept calling him Eddie. How are you, Eddie? And he said, I don't know you. And then the next day he found Eddie, and it was like looking in the mirror. And they pieced it together that they were both adopted from the same adoption agency in New York. And then, because of that publicity, a third one came up and said, oh my God, I'm an identical twin with you guys too. So they're phenomenal. It's such a powerful design. It's so dramatic, when you see these identical twins, reared together, I mean, that's pretty dramatic too. But these identical twins reared apart, and they find it's like looking in a mirror, not just physically, but they came to realize how similar they are in everything, in personality. There's differences, but it's like variations on the same theme. And for example, they were all interested in kind of different things. Like one was, I think, going to be an engineer. But by talking to each other, they all realized they really have a strong artistic drive. And they're now actually all in acting school because they've kind of just decided that's really what they want to do. So I think that's really dramatic. So that's a great film to kind of recommend, Three Identical Strangers. Sure. I can't wait to see it myself.
Yeah, I would like to see it.
That's what people think about when you say twins. Identical twins reared apart. I did do with Nancy Pedersen and Gerald McLaren a large study, the largest study of twins reared apart in Sweden. Because unlike the Minnesota study, which is what I was describing, you could use systematic records. There was always the question in Bouchard's twins reared apart study, maybe these twins like the ones I just described, identical twins reared apart, maybe they got to know each other because they're so unbelievably similar looking. And, maybe there are identical twins reared apart who aren't so similar, but they don't know about it because they're not so similar. So we did a large study of twins reared apart in Sweden because they have excellent records. There are no phony birth certificates as there are in the US. Your biological father on your birth is your biological father. And in the States, they put in the adoptive father on the birth record as if he's the real father, for example. I don't know if they still do that, but they did it when I was there. So in Sweden, we could get a systematic study, but we get the same results, showing everything's at least 50% heritable. But when I went to Colorado, I decided there's enough twin studies, like there was the Louisville twin study. And that's studies of twins reared together. 1% of all births are twins. 1/3 of them are called identical twins, monozygotic, a single fertilized egg. So they are clones. In fact, they're more clones than clones, because if you or I were cloned, we took a cell from our body and made it omnipotent, or whatever that's called, so that we could, or a stem cell or something, so that we could use it to create a new individual. That individual, our clone with the same DNA as us, would be raised in a different woman, unlike twins who are raised in the same woman, and they'd be in a different era. They grew up in Trump land rather than in the swinging 60s, like me. So identical twins are actually more clones than clones. And then the other 2/3 of twins are, I said 1% of all births are twins, 1/3 of those are identical twins. The other 2/3 are like any brother and sister. They're 50% similar genetically, but they're born in the same womb at the same time, grow up in the same family in the same era. So if the twin method is simply saying that if it's a really simple design at some level, a biological experiment in a way, quasi-experiment. If a trait is heritable, you'd have to predict that the identical twins, who are twice as similar as fraternal twins, would be more similar for the trait. So that's the twin method. And there were quite a few of those studies around. The Louisville twin study was a study begun by Steve Vandenberg, who was at the University of Colorado when I went there, and then carried on by Ron Wilson. And it was interested particularly in cognitive development in twins. So I thought there were enough twin studies, and based on the Texas adoption project, I wanted to do an adoption project. So I talked to John DeFries about it, who's always been my closest colleague, and he was very encouraging. He was a professor, and I was there as a new assistant professor. But some people, including John, said this is like the classically bad idea for an assistant professor to say, I'd like to do this long-term, longitudinal study of adoption, and
wait till you get tenure before you can do a longitudinal study,
right. Yeah,
which is not very good for longitudinal studies to wait.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm always an optimist, though, and somehow that really didn't worry me at all. But I spent the first 3 years trying to get a grant for this, and it was at a time when nobody would get grants for genetics. Genetics was really not cool in terms of psychology. So for about 3 years, I was in Boulder, and that's about 30 miles from Denver. And that's where I found these adoption agencies that were very keen to participate in this research, because our basic questions of nature and nurture are sort of applied questions in terms of adoption agencies. The adoptive parents they want to know, how important is genetics, how important is environment. So anyway, they were very cooperative, but because I had no money, I wanted to test the biological mothers, because in those days, and this is the early 70s, so it's the end of the swinging 60s, and it was before birth control was available to unmarried women, and it was before abortion was legalized. Today, we heard about Brett Kavanaugh, and you wonder, is Roe v. Wade going to survive? But back then, abortion wasn't legal. And so many young women who were pregnant went to adoption homes. They called homes for unwed mothers, and they, in a different city, and they would have their kid and then leave the kid for adoption and never have any contact again. So unlike adoption today, where there's often communication between the birth parents and the adoptive parents, that didn't happen back then. So here you've got these women, girls, 13 to 28, who were in the last trimester of their pregnancy living in these homes for unwed mothers in Denver. And so I spent my weekends driving from Boulder to Denver and testing them. I had 3 hours to test them, and then I could never have contact with them again, because part of the deal was anonymity, that they sort of wanted to give their baby up for adoption and get on with their life. So my only problem is I couldn't get out of there because they were so bored. They were thrilled to be taking these tests and have someone taking an interest in them, that sort of thing. And so then we've studied the idea of an adoption study. A twin study is like a biological experiment where you have two types of twins, one 100% similar genetically, pair by pair, the other 50% similar. The adoption method is like a social experiment. We know that nature and nurture go together. When you say schizophrenia runs in families, environmentalists had no problem with that. That's nurture. But we say, well, it could be nature, and now we know it's all nature. What runs in families is nature, not nurture. So the adoption design separates nature and nurture through this social experiment by studying parents who adopt these children and give them their homes from early in life. So they share family environment nurture, but they're not genetically related to the kids. Mm-hmm. And then you have biological parents who relinquish the kids for adoption at birth. They share nature, genetics, but they don't share that postnatal family environment with the kids. And then I was proud to think that in the Colorado Adoption Project, it would be good to have what we call control families matched to the adoptive families. These are families who, there's no good word for it, not regular families, but parents and offspring who share genes and environment, the usual sort of family environment. So I finally got funding after the third try in the late 70s to follow these kids and their families and then other kids born into those families. And we've been funded at IBG. I'm only a co-investigator on it, but we've been funded to follow them up at 40 years of age, which is incredible. Pretty cool. Yeah. That's sort of how my early career started. In the Colorado Adoption Project, we tried to study everything because we knew there wouldn't be other studies like that. And what I've learned is when you try to do a study of everything, you don't really do a study of anything, because you can't study anything well enough if you try to, cover the waterfront. Yeah. But we did do a lot of interesting novel things. And one of those was to put in environmental measures of the home environment. There's this measure called home observation for measurement of the environment. And it's probably the most widely used observational measure of infant and early childhood home environments relevant to cognitive development. And so we put that in the Colorado Adoption Project because I'm interested in development, the interplay between genes and environment in development, but then also to get a handle on the environment rather than just always treating it as the anonymous component of variance that's a residual from what you don't explain from genetics.
Mm-hmm.
So one example of what came up that was quite shocking is when I looked at the data for adoptive and non-adoptive siblings, we found evidence for genetic influence on home environment. Like the home is one of the better correlates of cognitive development, and it's a measure of the environment, right? So it shouldn't show genetic influence.
Or like TV watching, it has a heritability, right? Something like that.
Yes, it's sort of that thing. Did you say TV watching?
Yeah, television watching. Yeah. That was surprising when I saw that. It has a pretty
That was also in that study too. But what we found is that all these measures of the environment in the adoption design show genetic influence.
So like number of books in the house, right? Things like that.
Yep. And I decided, so that led to this idea of the nature of nurture, which I'm sure we'll get onto. But the television viewing, which you bring up now, I decided to do because after several years, I started realizing that measures of the environment usually show some genetic influence. And that's kind of a profound thing in a way. It suggests that the environment isn't out there happening to us. We make our environments. So I used this television viewing thing. By then I was a professor. And the nice thing about tenure is you don't have to care so much, about what people think. And really, some people said it was like a suicide note, writing a paper saying television viewing is genetically influenced, because it's used in thousands. Someone told me 5,000 studies as an environmental measure. It was a big deal back in the 70s and 80s. And, I was even surprised by it because, you think parents control whether the kids watch television or not, but they don't really. And some kids want to watch television more than others. And I think, as the case of all environmental measures we use in psychology, it's not the environment out there. People create their environments. So kids can turn television on or off, at will. So I think it makes a profound point about how genotypes become phenotypes. It isn't that DNA just can sit on the table here and create an organism. It has to work in an environment. And kids create and select and modify their environments in a way that's correlated with their genetic inclination.
I mean, that's interesting. Do you think that some kids were more inclined to watch Mr. Rogers versus, when we talk about individual differences in content of television viewing, when you get to that level, I mean, I really strongly want to believe that Mr. Rogers really influenced me profoundly as a child, that if I didn't have Mr. Rogers in my life, I would maybe have turned out different. But are you maybe suggesting that my actual active genotype sought out and was attracted by the messages he was providing?
Yep. Well, we had this 10-minute interview to measure the kids' television viewing. As you know, any of these things, to measure it right, someone say, oh, all I got to do is use this 1-hour interview. Well, we couldn't spend all that time when we went to the homes of these hundreds of families year after year. So we had a 10-minute interview, and all we could really measure reliably was the overall quantity of viewing. But as I mentioned in the book, we also took a look at some other things, like broad categories of content, like comedy or action or educational programs, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And I was amused to find that, mostly because I don't get comedy very well. I mean, I don't find many comedy programs funny, especially, the TV serial sorts of comedies.
Well, I'm honored you laughed at my joke then. That makes it even more special that you laughed.
No, Mr. Rogers, I agree with you,
Yeah.
What would we do without Mr. Rogers?
What would we do without him? I mean, it's like, there's no Mr. Rogers gene.
This is so sad, Scott, you know?
Yeah. Why is it sad?
Well, people are going to say, God, those boffins, as they call them here in England,
What does that word mean? Oh, nerdy, yeah.
Boffin's sort of like a scientist in an ivory tower who can't button his shirt,
Oh, I've never heard that expression before.
Oh, boffin? No, that.
Maybe that's good. Maybe that means I've never been called
to here in England.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But anyway, I did that television viewing study. It shows genetic influence on not only quantity of viewing, but one of the more heritable categories of viewing was comedy. There's strong genetic influence on how much you enjoy comedy. And comedy television programs in the 1970s and 80s, which is probably quite a different thing from nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. And that's a whole separate empirical question. How has comedy changed over the years? We don't need to go there. Hey, everyone, just wanted to take this moment to thank you all for your support of the podcast over the years. It's been a real privilege to do this podcast for you all for the past 4 years. It's been a real labor of love. If you'd like to further support the podcast, I wanted to let you know a few things you could do to help make this podcast a better experience for you all. First, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the Psychology Podcast on iTunes. This would help make the show more prominent on iTunes and increase our listenership. I believe you can subscribe both on your iPhone and on your computer. Second, it'd be great if you give the show a rating and review on iTunes. I definitely read all of the reviews, and they are helpful to others who are thinking about giving the show a listen. Another thing you can do is become a patron of the show by going to www.patreon.com/psychpodcast. That's www.patreon.com/psychpodcast. There are various options, which include the ability to ask your own questions to a guest on the show and to have a 30-minute Skype session with me. Thanks again for your incredible support of the show over the years. I do the show for you all because I truly love sharing my enthusiasm and love of the mind, brain, and creativity, and I really appreciate you joining me on this journey. Okay, now back to the show. So let's really get into some of the biggest findings in psychology in your lifetime, relating to your life's work. So following naturally from what you just said, almost everything is heritable. Every psychological trait.
Could I catch you up there?
Yes.
I know where you're going with this, but I think that first law of behavioral genetics, that everything is heritable, and not just significantly, but substantially, is such an important point. Because in my career, back in the 70s, convincing anybody that anything is heritable was a very difficult task.
Right.
It's good to kind of step back and say, there's been a massive change. I mean, to the point where I've even been telling people, I wonder if you agree with this, I think we ought to challenge anybody to come up with any trait that's reliably measured and sufficiently powered in a behavioral genetics study that shows no genetic influence.
Actually, I did a broad literature search to answer that question when I was working on my book on gifted. And I'm literally Googling my book right now because I don't remember what the two I found were, but you might be interested to see what they are. Okay, I'm literally Googling my book right now. Hold on, I'm going to find this. Yeah, because I found it fascinating that, the most important lesson, I'm just literally reading a paragraph from my book, hope you don't mind.
Right.
The most important lesson researchers have learned over 25 years worth of twin studies is that virtually every psychological trait you can measure, including IQ, personality, artistic ability, mathematical ability, musical ability, writing, humor styles, there you go, creative dancing, sports, happiness, persistence, marital status, television viewing, female orgasm rates, aggression, empathy, altruism, leadership, risk-taking, novelty-seeking, political preferences, television viewing. I repeated television viewing. My editor never picked up on that. Oh, well, sorry. And even rates of Australian teens talking on their cell phones has a heritable basis. Because our psychological characteristics reflect the physical structures of our brains, and because our genes contribute to those physical structures, it is unlikely that there are any psychological characteristics that are completely unaffected by our DNA. And then I have a footnote where I do list something that I found. Although a few traits such as love styles and materialism don't appear to have a heritable basis. Okay, so those are the only, I did find those two things.
Yeah. I know a little bit about that romantic love style thing, and I think there have been subsequent studies showing.
Oh, really? Well, this was published in 2013, so it's entirely possible.
Yeah, and but what was the other one, Scott?
Materialism, interestingly enough.
I find that hard to believe because interests all show genetic influence, don't they?
I know. Yeah, I mean, you're right. But vocational interests certainly do. But, the extent to which you value money, it seems to have a much greater environmental influence. I could try to track down that paper, but
I don't know. Yeah. But for my dissertation in 1974, in a twin study, a family twin study of personality development, I thought what's troubling me is that everything seems to be moderately heritable. And this temperament thing I was working on with Arnold Buss was trying to say which aspects of personality are more heritable than others. And we wrote 2 books on this. The EASY theory, EASI, emotionality, activity, sociability, shyness, and impulsivity, picking these as the most heritable traits. And they also seem to be evolutionarily important in that you see them in all primates and most mammals, these traits, emotionality.
Yeah.
But then in the end, I think we got to say there's no evidence that they're any more heritable than any other traits, right?
Yeah.
So for my dissertation, I did a survey of psychologists saying, what traits do you think will show no heritability? And the ones that I put into my dissertation were things that I thought as well would not show heritable influence. Like, how about table manners? Kids. This is in kids now. And
well, that's probably correlated with agreeableness.
Well, that's the thing.
Yeah.
But you know that now. But back then, I think it was reasonable to think, well, these are the things that psychologists think couldn't possibly show genetic. Because, table manners, their parents either insist on it or they don't. Brushing your teeth after meals,
Yeah.
So I put in those things and, they came out just as heritable as everything else.
Yeah. Okay. So this one was interesting. I didn't know this when I was reading your book. Did you say weather is heritable?
Yeah.
You got to explain that to our listeners.
I think when people get into this nature of nurture idea, the idea that what in psychology we call the environment isn't the environment out there. Like life events. Does shit just happen to you? Does divorce just happen to you? As if you don't have anything to do with it?
Right.
You think about it for a minute, you think, no way. And that's where the genetics comes in. You do have something to do with your environments. So I use this just a provocative thing. When you start thinking about this, what environmental thing that we measure in psychology could not possibly show genetic influence? So then it's sort of a joke, about Mark Twain, and people always talk about the weather, but you can't do anything about it. Nobody does anything about it, And so then I said, is that true? If you had seasonal affective disorder, you might choose not to live in England,
That's right.
And so people can choose it that way. But a more profound aspect of it that I talk about in the book is relevant to me. I'm such a, disgustingly optimistic person. I drive people kind of mad because, I always see positive aspects of things. And even the weather in England, you asked me about last summer's weather. And I remember sailing and swimming and, walks in the sun. And other people said, are you out of your mind? It was the worst summer on record, Yeah. But what matters to me, in a way, is my perception. That's my experience of it. Even if it's totally off base, that's what affects me, I think. So that, I think, is the more profound aspect of the weather. It's how you perceive it. And
well, that's a profound point right there, because we can build up from weather, or build down from weather.
That's right. Yeah.
Because, there's like resiliency, post-traumatic growth. Who are those that have experienced post-traumatic stress versus post-traumatic growth from trauma? I mean, this is a very important question in the field of positive psychology, right?
Yeah.
And other fields. So no, it's quite.
And that's a great example, because, the trauma that you're talking about, this is horrendous stuff. But for, a lot of people, you can understand if someone's devastated by it and their life falls apart.
Yeah.
But any experience like that, some people will be more resilient to it, to the point where you're saying that it's actually, what did you call it? Growth.
Post-traumatic growth. Yeah. There's a whole field on that.
Yeah.
Not only a whole field on that, but I was going to mention this later in the conversation, but it seems relevant now. I've been fascinated with research on the effects of extreme trauma on the brain. You don't go too much in your book on kind of extremes of environmental adversity, but I've been very interested in looking at some of that recent research on like emotional abuse or severe sexual abuse in childhood. And it really does alter connections long-term in the brain and how we process reward, how we process, whether or not we are more avoidant in our lives versus approach-oriented. But in that research, I found this subset of research within that field showing that surprisingly, some brains show those connections, but those individuals are still thriving in life despite those altered brain connections. Whereas some other individuals show the same exact brain alterations from these experiences, but suffer more from depression and anxiety. And I think that is an absolutely fascinating line of research, is understanding sort of what are the explanations for this. Despite you taking people with the same exact effect neurologically, on the traumatic experience. And some people seem to have maybe some protective factors of some sort that interact.
Yeah. And that's probably a good point, just to interject something that in all the media that comes about from my book, I realize is so important to say. You mentioned it, that I don't talk much about extreme environmental events or extreme genetic events like mutations, for example,
that's a good point,
chromosomal anomalies. And what we're studying is the normal range of variation in the particular samples that we can study. And that's not trivial, I mean, it's the world we live in, but we're describing the genetic and environmental causes of the differences we see in this normal bell-shaped curve. And that those descriptive statistics can change in a different culture. It's kind of surprising how similar the results tend to be across different cultures, but they're not maximally different cultures. And they're also, it's the normal range as well. So when you go outside to trauma or abuse, all bets are off. I mean, you can have a highly heritable trait and you can totally screw it up with a severe environment. But I also like to say you could totally screw it up with some weird genetic effect too. I mean, you feed kids mutagens and you can have weird effects as well. So I don't want to trivialize those extremes, because for the people affected by single gene disorders or by severe environmental trauma, these are tremendous effects.
Tremendous,
but they don't explain a lot of variation in the population.
I'm truly glad that you made that point, because I read a terrible review of your book recently in Nature. I don't know if you saw that one.
Oh, yeah. It was so bad it was good.
And I think that what people sometimes may do is project. And I think I see this sometimes in the media, like project onto scientists, well, they must believe X, Y, Z because they said A or B. Mm-hmm. And so I'm glad that you're on the record making that point, because I think that is a really important point. I mean, there were things that I read in some, like that review and some other reviews, where I'm like, well, I don't think Robert would actually say that to me, like if we actually had a conversation. So I'm glad that actually happened where you made that point. So that was good that you made that point. And I think that, like, it makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. Like, tell me what you think of this. I mean, we have the genes, we evolved to process a certain range of environments. But when we have such extreme conditions that are totally like uninterpretable to the genes, so to speak, that's a metaphor. It's not obviously like they're cognitively processing it, that it would make sense. It would throw out of whack, or from an entropy perspective, it would increase entropy dramatically, right?
Yeah, I really agree.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so let's go into these biggest findings in psychology. So another one.
We've done the first one, actually.
We did.
The nature of nurture.
We sure did. So we have 4 to go. We have 4 to go, right? So development. Let's talk about development, how heritability increases.
First, I'd like to say, of those 5, it's interesting to me that 2 of them are very much about the environment, the nature of nurture, and the last one, the non-shared environment sort of thing. And we only have those findings because we have genetic designs that consider environment in a genetically sensitive sort of design. And the decades of work that ignored genetics couldn't do that because they're completely confounding genetics and environment. The other thing I'd like to say about that is that these 2 environmental findings are the ones that kind of lead me to the implications that I talk about in the subsequent chapters. We'll kind of put those together after we describe these findings. About development, the bottom line there is that for a lot of traits like personality, there isn't much evidence for changes in heritability, that is, the extent to which inherited DNA differences are important in explaining the variance of a trait. There isn't much evidence that heritability changes during development. Mm-hmm. But when it changes, as it goes up. I don't think there's an example of heritability going down. And the reason that's important is that in psychology, we need counterintuitive findings. If we're always finding things that confirm what your grandmother knew, that's okay, that's science, but it's not very interesting or exciting. Whereas if you can talk to a public audience and tell them what heritability means and ask, do you think heritability goes up or down during development over your life? They'll say it goes down, and you ask why. And it's because, well, in the environment builds up, accidents, illnesses, slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, those increasingly explain the differences between people. Part of that assumes that genetics is static, it happens at the moment of birth. So it's interesting to say that heritability increases, and the trait that is clearest is intelligence, where heritability increases from like 20% in infancy to 40% in childhood to 60% in adulthood, and some people say 80% in later life, bar dementia. And those are huge percentages of variance. When we talk about heritability being about 50%, it's important to say, what else in psychology we got explains 5% of the variance?
Right.
So 50% is a lot of the variance, and increasing the variance explained from 20% to 60 or 80% is off the scale of what we find in psychology. So this is a really big change. It leads to the question, well, why could that happen?
Yeah,
and I think the
question.
basic answer is nobody knows, but it seemed most people, I kind of think that it has something to do with GE correlation.
Yeah.
That is, it's sort of what I was saying before, that the environment, that genes don't just work by themselves, that genotypes become phenotypes through the use of the environment. So, musically gifted kids, it would almost be difficult to stop them from developing their musical ability.
Ellen Winter has referred to them as having a rage to master.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And whether it's mastery or not, whether it's just
engagement,
getting off on music, they'll just sing to themselves, they'll bang on pots, they'll listen to radio, they'll hang out with friends who like music. Yeah. So they're creating environments that are correlated with their genetic propensity so that the genes nudge people in different directions, and then those differences snowball as you go through life. And so those genetic nudges become bigger differences later on. So I've got this 97-year-old father who lives in a residential place with a lot of older people, and the differences are in cognitive related ability experiences are amazing. There's some people who just sit lobotomized by TV. I think a lot of sad older people do. But there's others who are, desperate to engage in arguments and conversations with people, and they're still up on the news. And I think that's sort of the end of this snowballing process, I think. So it's a very important concept, and intelligence is the best example of increasing heritability. Some people say it's there for weight, and some people say for depression, but I think that's less well documented.
Well, so I always, tell me if I'm interpreting this incorrectly, I always viewed that increasing heritability as, I agree with you about the gene-environment correlation, explain the effect, but you can't parse environment out of that equation. It's not like we become who we are just naturally, completely regardless of the environment we experienced in our lifetime. It seems like from a explain this as a developmental within person perspective, not large populations, trying to explain variance, but within a person, it seems like you can't simply remove, the opportunities that you've had in your life, or that, when you seek out these opportunities, people have to actually allow those opportunities to happen. Right. And there are other.
So in a 1977 paper in Psych Bulletin, with John Lowland and John DeFries, we sort of talk about this issue, and it's a bit tricky because, as you're saying, the genes by themselves can't do anything.
You're right.
But it's this matter of genes kind of pushing you towards certain environments. Like where I see it, I particularly am interested in the business end of cognitive development in schools, with children. It's an educational achievement. And, teachers will tell you, that they're teaching the kids the same sort of curriculum, but some of them just eat it up,
right.
And they're shooting off, and others really struggle, and you have to put more energy into it. So they need that environment. You lock a kid in a closet and they're not going to develop cognitively. But it's even more basic than that. DNA by itself can't do anything. It needs a cell. It needs an organism, for that cell, and it needs an environment outside the organism. And the genes work to have you use those environments, to follow that propensity. And it is just a nudge. It's not deterministic, which is another thing I get in these comments from my book.
Yeah.
We're not saying genes determine the behavior. It's just other things being equal, on average, in the populations with these genes and these environments, we're finding genetics accounts for a huge amount of variance. But it's on average. So even with obesity, could surprises people to find it's maybe 70% heritable. BMI, body mass index, maybe 70% heritable. But it's not the genes determining your body weight. It could have been 100% heritability, but if you just stop eating, you're going to lose weight.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Or let's say you have a genetic propensity towards alcoholism, but you'll grow up in a culture where you never see alcohol your entire life. It's not going to trigger that propensity, which, brings up a really fascinating point about how we can change our destiny? Where does the free will come in? I think a lot of people are curious about that. And it seems like one way is kind of tying yourself to the mast, or like limiting the experiences that won't tickle your genome in a bad way. I've never put it that way before, but it seems like...
No. This is kind of the crux of the DNA revolution and how it's going to impact psychology, society, and ourselves, our self-understanding. And I've been upsetting people by saying, all the concerns about direct-to-consumer testing, and I'm sure we'll get into the DNA side of this soon, but just to skip ahead to that, I think, because it's relevant to this particular point, we could say in behavioral genetics that if you're male and your father was alcoholic, you're at a 5-fold greater risk of being alcoholic. Mm-hmm. But that's sort of a family-wide risk for you and your brother and your sister. But with DNA, we can say you have a genetic risk, say 10-fold, and your brother doesn't, because siblings are 50% similar, but 50% different genetically. And people say, oh, God, that's so terrible to have your genetic future foretold. Well, alcoholism is a great example because, as you say, you just cannot become alcoholic unless you drink a lot of alcohol. Mm-hmm. And what worries me is our universities are sort of like experiments to find out if you have a genetic propensity for alcoholism because you're so overloaded with alcohol. So I think if you found out that you had a genetic risk, I would like the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, which is one of the great things about the UK. They already do genetic testing. All countries around the world do neonatal genetic testing for PKU and things like that. For the same amount of money, they could get these SNP chips and do this genetic sort of testing that I'm talking about. And then if you found that you, say, had a 10-fold greater risk of becoming alcoholic, wouldn't it be almost unethical not to tell you? They're not going to say, we're going to be totalitarian and take away alcohol. They're just going to say, thought you'd like to know that if you drink as much as other people, they're not going to become alcoholic, but you could. You have a much greater risk of becoming alcoholic. And you can judge that information and say, yeah, is it worth it? Maybe I need to monitor my alcohol. Maybe I need to take these month-long breaks from alcohol.
I'm just going to be cheeky for a second, but I mean, isn't this going to interact with other traits? Like, what if you also have a high propensity for OCD or neuroticism? Wouldn't that make you you live a life where you're constantly everywhere you look, you're like, oh no, that might lead to alcoholism because I have a high probability. I'm saying, do you see what I'm saying? Like, wouldn't that interact with each other where you become obsessed with this your whole life?
Well, it's a good point that people aren't schizophrenic or alcoholic. They are people. Yeah. And they have various problems as we all do. And so, I take your point, but I do think alcoholism is such a severe problem that it's probably okay to kind of focus on that and say, yeah, you're an individual. And, maybe if you're OCD or whatever, and I tell you have a risk for alcoholism, you're going to freak out.
Yeah.
But, is that so bad? I mean,
right. But there could be other things.
OCD.
Yeah, but you could see, other examples where it would be pretty bad. Intelligence. Well, intelligence is a really interesting one because we actually know more about the genetics that influence low intelligence. We don't really know very much about genetics that influence extraordinarily high IQ. So that's interesting, right? What would you be able to foretell in that situation, that you have a genetic predilection to have a low IQ? And then what would that knowledge, how can that help you in life?
Yeah. Well, intelligence is the toughest one, but I'll get to it.
I went right there, didn't I?
Yeah. But no, that's good. And, I have done studies, very large samples, looking at low versus high intelligence. And in general, you find that all of these, what we call disorders, are really part of the quantitative distribution, which we're going to get to. That's this finding on the abnormal is normal. But I think where you were going with this is to say, what if you find out you have a kid who has a genetic prediction of lower IQ?
Yeah, their polygenic score, because we're talking about thousands of genes, right? But
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we're not saying one gene, but we're saying that all of those genes together, we know that in the general population that's correlated with low IQ. Do you think that is valuable information for anyone at that age?
If you find you have university parents, this is the toughest one, to face when your kid isn't doing well at school. And I actually think we can take that on with polygenic scores. I think one of the biggest impacts going to be for people to realize how different siblings are. So parents who are university educated, they find one kid isn't doing well at school and the other kid is. This is like me and my sister. My sister was slow to learn to read. She didn't do well at school. She didn't like school. It was hard for her. I love school. I couldn't wait to go to school, and I love to read. And, as a parent, you can't, my parents didn't go to university, so it wasn't the problem of university educated parents can't bear the thought of their kid not going to university. I suspect I haven't done this, but if I tested my sister, I bet she doesn't have a very high polygenic score for intelligence or educational achievement. And my parents didn't worry about that. I mean, no one in my family went to university. So the weird one was me going to university, not the rest of them not going to university. So I think it would be good for parents to know how different kids are. And if you found that one of your kids didn't have such a high score for educational achievement, it's sort of tough to take in one way because we value intelligence so much in our society.
We do and we don't. We do and we don't, right? Like we maybe say we do, but we actually don't want to talk about it, right?
Well, that's true. And there's all this stuff about we've had enough experts, and populism in a way might go against intelligence. But the point I wanted to make is that maybe it would be good for parents to know that one kid maybe isn't academically oriented. And is the goal that all kids should go to university? Maybe it's better to recognize some kids aren't really cut out for it. And they probably don't like it either. It's this kind of circle of appetites and aptitudes. And I was doing a thing with CNN in Switzerland earlier today, and they're very keen on their vocational training with apprenticeships where people get into really good jobs, highly paid, stable jobs that are very enjoyable because they value these jobs. And do we only value, in England, it's terrible. You either go into academic university tracks or you go into what they call O levels, occupational levels. But that's like, play with your pencils until you get to be 16. There's no training. There's no apprenticeship program. There's no job at the end of it other than, flipping hamburgers.
So when you said some people are not cut out for it, I think that's an interesting statement, and it actually, I want to be honest, it raises my blood pressure a bit when you said it. So I'm trying to really suppress my emotion when you said that, so I can really think about that as analytically as possible. Because I feel like, should the genes tell us that information, though, whether we're cut out for it, or should the person, the human, tell us that once they've had the opportunities and tell us how interested or motivated they are to do it? So
absolutely,
yeah.
But
you know what I'm saying?
You're implying you're upset about it because you think it somehow has been deterministic, and I'm not saying that at all. You could make your kid, force them to work hard at school, give them extra tutoring and all of that. But might it not be better to go back to what you were saying before about going with the grain, going with the flow rather than swimming upstream? Just to say, maybe it's the cutout that bothers you. But maybe, as a parent, you want to do what's best for your kids. You want to maximize their strengths and minimize their weaknesses. You don't want to preordain what they ought to do, like go to university. So I agree with that. But I think another part of this is selection. And, that's where a lot of this comes in, that we select kids for the better schools and university. And I agree completely with you. I would rather get rid of selection. And so, like Open University here in England, let everybody go to university. Don't just take the ones who did well in high school. That's a pretty good predictor of how you're going to do at university. But there's a lot of kids, screw up in high school, but then they get their act together and they really want to go to university. Let them go to university and see how they do at university. Sort of like adaptive testing in a way.
I do like that. Yeah, I actually giving the people the opportunity before,
absolutely,
not making decisions before we do that. So analytically, the analytical argument here I would have is that we only know that, like, in terms of individual prediction, the highest estimate I've seen is that polygenic scores only explain 14% of differences in IQ, and maybe a little bit higher for educational attainment. Why not just stick with the phenotype? Why not stick with, like, there are tests that are better predictors than polygenic scores. I published this paper in Intelligence with some of the leading IQ test constructors, finding that the correlation between the GEF, general intelligence factor, and the academic achievement factor was like above 0.74 starting at age 2. So we looked at developmentally, age 2 to 7, and the correlation did seem to increase. There was a trend. It actually went up to as high as 0.94. The correlation being that's talk about percent variance explained. That's extraordinarily high. It seems like that beats the pants off of a polygenic score.
But in fact, you can't predict from 2-year-olds. You cannot predict. What did you say? How much of the variance? 50% of the variance of high school.
We're talking about so at the same age. So 2-year-olds, the correlation between there. But if you're talking about
what's educational achievement in 2-year-olds?
Right. I mean, that's a good point, but we looked at it up to age 17. But it's an important
point because DNA can predict from birth. Nothing else can predict educational achievement from birth.
Well, what about Fagan's research on showing infinite...
I was involved in that. It doesn't predict anything.
What? He wrote a book chapter for my Cambridge Book of Intelligence where he said that you can predict infant attention measures about 0.34 with IQ at age 17.
Yeah, not true. I think subsequent studies don't confirm that. I don't think you can predict anything. Just like you can't really predict adult height from infant height. A birth weight, an infant weight doesn't predict at all later weight, right? The only thing that predicts in an individual is DNA. And having that predictive power, I think, could be useful to identify kids who are likely to have problems and give them extra help, for example. But intelligence is the hardest one of all. If I talk about reading disability, no one has problems with any of these issues, right?
Right. Sure. The dyslexia, maybe it could be useful information to see if you're at risk.
But you can't predict that from anything else. You can't test reading until they read. And by that time, they have the reading problems. But what you can do is if you could predict who's going to have reading problems, they almost all have language problems earlier. And there are good intervention programs for language, like at 2, 3, 4 years of age, before kids learn to read. So you could actually prevent reading problems by intervening with language interventions.
What I don't understand is because this 14% number for IQ, it shows that this, matters to some extent, but it shows there's just so much unexplained variation that the question of at age 2, do we want to make that decision that person's not cut out for it, at age 2 based on so much unexplained variables that we don't know in that child's life yet. I would argue that would be dangerous, in fact, to do so.
It's useful information. Unlike the reading disability example I just gave you. It still is explaining a lot more variance than we can explain with other things. It's very predictive. And what you're saying is you could predict with childhood intelligence, you could make a better prediction of achievement. Well, with school achievement, 2 years ago, we could explain 2 or 3% of the variance in educational achievement using educational attainment in adults in a genome-wide association study. And yet it still would predict 2 or 3% of the variance. Then, last year with that new GWAS for educational attainment, we can explain 10% of the variance. This year, with the paper that just came out a couple months ago 14%. With 1.1 million people, we can explain 15% of the variance in these GCSE scores.
It's impressive.
And now you say, well, that's not that much. But in England, we have these amazing Ofsted ratings of schools. They're really £20,000 per assessment. They do it every 3 to 5 years of every school. They're the best sort of rating of a school quality you could do. They're not perfect, but nothing is. How much variance in GCSE scores is accounted for by how good the school is you went to? And the answer is about 2 or 3%.
So I certainly agree. It's scientifically impressive. And by the way, kudos to the researchers who are making such strides in their discoveries. What I'm questioning is, how do you get from 14% of the experience explained to fortune telling? To me, that seems like such a leap that you made in your book that doesn't seem warranted based on the evidence, but you think it is warranted?
Yeah, absolutely. What about alcoholism? That's not such a good predictor. How much of the variance and liability of alcoholism can we predict now?
What is the, I don't actually know.
It's not much. I don't know, 6, 7%. But what else predicts alcoholism other than alcoholism in the parents? What in the individual would give you an individual prediction of alcoholism? Now, it's all going to get a lot stronger, right? Because heritability of the liability to alcoholism is 40% or something like that, 50%. So these are going to get stronger. But even right now, wouldn't you want to know that you have an elevated risk for alcoholism?
I'm thinking that through. I don't think the answer is obviously yes. So that's why I'm thinking this through. Because of the extent to which there's so much error in that estimate.
Yeah, but Scott, we never have strong predictors in the
I agree with
behavioral
that.
science. How about this? Drinking, how much of the variance in automobile accidents is accounted for by blood alcohol levels?
So I imagine it's pretty high.
No, I don't think so. I think it's quite low. There's a lot of reasons why people have accidents. And actually, I did work on blood alcohol level. It's not that predictive of performance. It is true that people who are drunk out of their minds are more likely to have an accident, but there's actually a lot of people who can drive very drunk and not get in accidents. So all I'm saying is we make laws, very severe laws about drink driving, and I agree with them, but I don't think blood alcohol levels correlates that much with total accidents. And I think a lot of things like, what about smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day and lung cancer? One of the stronger relationships. It doesn't explain a lot of variance. You know people who smoke 2 packs a day and don't have lung cancer, and you know people who don't smoke much at all that do get lung cancer. None of our predictions are ever perfect, but those are ones that we make, massive decisions about, almost legal decisions in the case of drunk driving. So I think it's unrealistic to expect that we're going to explain all of the heritability even. And we know we're not going to explain all the variants because these things are only 50% heritable to begin with. But I think it's very useful information, like with reading disability. That's my main goal, is to be able to predict early in order to prevent problems.
Yeah, and I think it is an interesting question. To what degree can that information inform a useful intervention? Because I would hate to see it used strictly as a sorting mechanism. Now, if there's some purpose to it, like some sort of to help the child, then I can start to see a greater humanitarian purpose. But when it becomes strictly as like, we're going to read the genetic information of 2-year-olds and then use that information to sort those who are not cut out versus those who are cut out and give all the resources.
No, you're misreading it. My book, I very much say that's not the purpose. I don't want selection. I want to avoid selection. But if you are going to select, you ought to do it well. But I much would prefer that we don't have any selection at all. The example that I would give that you're raising is I find university-educated parents have a great deal of difficulty accepting that one of their children is not doing well at school. If they knew that kid had a lower genetic propensity, that doesn't mean they give up on the kid. It just means they have to decide how much extra effort do they want to put into that. And they can do it. It's not deterministic. You can make up for that difference. But to what extent you don't want to preordain that all your children have to go to university or their life is wasted. If a kid's going to struggle with it, like my sister, instead of blaming her or blaming my parents, isn't it better to say, it's just a lot harder for her. I didn't deserve credit for doing so well at school. She doesn't deserve blame for doing poorly at school. So I think greater recognition and respect for genetically driven individual differences is important, and that polygenic scores can help us see that.
Yeah. I'm listening to your perspective, and I'm taking it very seriously and trying to think through all the implications of it. It's very interesting to think that we're all multidimensional, right? Success is a multifactorial determination. So, when I look at the genetic output of someone when they're young, intelligence is one dimension out of many psychological dimensions. Other dimensions could be like test anxiety. And it's an interesting question, the extent to which, is that person's test anxiety actually going to suppress their expression of their intelligence? I've tried to spend my whole career objectively as possible looking at this research, but I do still know that, what happened to me, I wasn't placed in, you probably don't know my story, but I was placed in special education as a child because of my intense anxiety that I had, just like generalized anxiety. I was anxious about everything, as well as an auditory processing disability. And people treated me as though I was stupid as a result of that. And that expectation, over the years sculpted who I became. So I do wonder, in terms of the implications of this research you're talking about, how much are we setting up a self-fulfilling prophecy by having people have certain expectations?
Yeah. And as I say, intelligence is the hardest one of all. But what if, we said alcoholism, no problem. What about even, depression? If you knew you had a genetic propensity to depression, doesn't that help in terms of self-understanding? I mean, as a parent, I would find it kind of useful information. It's not very predictive now, but it's sort of useful information. It's not going to determine people's outcomes, but it's part of self-understanding, understanding your kids. And in some ways, I think it could be useful in education. As I said, for reading disability, no problem. What about ADHD? I think something, that's going along pretty strong. They're coming up with the next goal of the PGC, the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium, is something like 80,000 cases of ADHD.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
And what's going to blow it open is when we get a polygenic score, that shows your genetic risk. And if you find, for example, it's sort of like a treatment by genetic interaction. If you found that, in the States, we're going through this battle now in the UK where people don't want to go the US way, where any kid diagnosed with ADHD gets amphetamines, methylphenidate. But what if you found that kids at high genetic risk really do respond well to methylphenidate? But maybe kids who are diagnosed as ADHD and don't have a high polygenic score, maybe they don't. Or even more, that you can get a polygenic score that can predict which kids will respond to methylphenidate and which won't, or even more, kids that will suffer from being on stimulants like methylphenidate. So I know there's a lot of doom mongers about the DNA revolution, but I do think, as I say in the book, the genie's out of the bottle and you're not going to stuff it back in anyway. So we might as well have these conversations to talk about, well, what limits do we want to impose on it? And, some people are saying, well, regulate the whole thing, don't allow direct-to-consumer testing. And, I just feel it's a bit paternalistic in this day of, the web and free information to tell people you can't have access to your DNA data if you want it. What's happening now is parents doing it for their kids. Then you can say, well, the kids can't provide informed consent and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of issues that come up around this, and I certainly don't have the answers. I'm not an ethicist, and
me neither.
Yeah.
And I agree with your book. I agree with you. You state now is the time to launch a broader public conversation about the applications and implications. And that's precisely what I'm doing in this conversation.
That's why I wrote the book.
Yeah. I'm glad you did. I'm glad you're opening these conversations.
We're going to get better and better polygenic scores, and the pace of discovery is quickening.
Absolutely. So let's move on from intelligence, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure.
I got out what I wanted to say, and I absolutely.
Okay. As long as you're not too upset about it.
Oh, but look,
I shouldn't use the what was
I
the
hope
word
I actually made an analytical case, though. That we're so far from actually at this point in explaining individual prediction. It's getting pretty impressive in terms of group level prediction, but the individual prediction of that, the phenotypical tests seem to be right now better predictors.
Yeah, but I show in the book that even last year's polygenic score that we use to predict, we call them GCSE levels. These are school leaving national exams at the age of 16. We call those GCSE scores. We were only explaining 10% of the variance, but if you take the kids in the top and bottom deciles, that you're talking about 80% of the ones in the top decile going to university and 25% of those in the bottom decile. Now, you could say, well, that's a group thing. Well, but it's not. That's just the reflection of a correlation of about 0.4 that explains 16% of the variance. That's a 0.4 is a correlation of moderate to large effect size in psychology. But you can say, but there's a lot of variation from that regression line that predicts, GCSE scores. I show in the book that with that sort of data, even though the mean differences for these deciles, if you divide the polygenic scores into tenths, the top and bottom decile differ a whole lot. Nonetheless, you can find a few kids in the lowest decile who do better on tests than kids in the highest decile. So it's not at all a perfect prediction.
I'm more concerned about how this could be applied. Maybe you're more optimistic than me.
I'm an optimist.
Yeah, maybe what's going on, maybe you're more optimistic that, we'll just people will just use this in a way that is not going to turn into you don't mention the history of eugenics. You don't mention that in your book. And I could understand on the one hand why not to mention it in your book, because it's not relevant to the science you've conducted. However, based on that history, it shows what humans are capable of, right? And my point is, I could see this unless we really have an open, honest conversation about what is the point of this information. So, I've been working in the field of educational psychology, and the field of gifted education is moving away from just using IQ scores as a predictor of giftedness, because it's not actually informing any intervention. It's just operating as a way of taking those who are above a certain range and putting them all in a room together and giving them enhanced resources. I could actually be more on board if you said something like, the dyslexia one's a great example, but maybe some of the group factors of intelligence. But general intelligence is a tricky one, because what if we say to a parent, your child has a real probability here of not doing well in school, then does that mean that if the child is not doing well in school, we say the causal reason was because they are dumb or they are low intelligence?
No.
No.
But wouldn't it be good to be able to predict? I like the Finnish model, for example, where you take kids, you just say we're going to put whatever resources are needed to bring kids up from the lowest to some minimal level of literacy and numeracy that you need to participate in our current technological sort of society. So I don't think there's no necessary policy implications from any of these data.
I hear you. And I think that the research that you've conducted is quite impressive in the extent to which genetics matters. I do think you underestimate the extent to which environment matters. So I've been looking at some recent meta-analyses I'd like to discuss with you. I think they paint a more nuanced picture about the role of the environment, and I just want to get your opinion on them.
Sure.
So I saw this Holderman et al. Meta-analysis, which was one of the most impressive meta-analyses I've ever seen, where they looked at virtually every single...
Amazing.
Isn't it incredible? Every single published, and they have this whole visualization. You can play with it. I've been playing with it online. The nerd... Wait, what was the word you used before in England of the nerdy person that I am?
Oh, buffin.
Yeah, the buffin that I am.
BOFFIN, yeah.
Yeah. And on the one hand, that conclusion from that paper is certainly that you're right that the shared environment effects are small, but there were effects. I see 0.13 for temperament and personality. So, to say that there's no effect there at all, I think is not quite correct.
Well, I do think it is correct, though. For personality and psychopathology, I don't see any evidence for shared environmental influence. If you look at the twin studies, I don't know why the meta-analysis shows that, but you look at these studies, I think one thing you find is there's a special twin effect. So that's kind of well documented, isn't it? That if you grow up with someone exactly the same age at exactly the same time, there's maybe a little bit more similarity than there would be in the population as a whole. I'm not against it, but I don't really see it. I don't accept that there is evidence for shared environmental influence for personality. Turkheimer's review, for example, in the Annual Review of Psychology, he doesn't find any, does he?
But this was the largest meta-analysis on the topic.
Yeah, but it's not very satisfactory in terms of what it includes, right? It includes all sorts of measures.
I believe in meta-analysis that includes everything ever studied, then a smaller sample, right?
Yeah, but it's not using the better studies, is it? For example, all the large studies I know are even for twin studies, consistently show no evidence for genetic influence. So I haven't gone into that because it's looked over tiny studies, big studies. I know meta-analysis has some advantages, but it also is gross, And you look at the bigger studies that have been done, and they consistently show no evidence for shared environment, except maybe for delinquency or antisocial behavior. There's a little evidence there, but then there's counter evidence saying it's really being partners in crime in adolescence, So I don't see it.
Yeah, I don't really have a card in this race. I just want to discuss these findings because I think they paint a more nuanced picture. And what I'm going to do, by the way, is on the show notes, I'm going to put all of these studies so the listeners can read them if they want. So I was fascinated by this Augustine Kong et al. Paper on what they refer to as the nature of nurture. Are you familiar with that paper?
Yeah, I reviewed it. I had it rejected from Science, I think, when I reviewed it.
So you don't think it is a high-quality paper?
Well, yeah, I don't think it's explaining much variance. And what I really disliked about it, it called it nature of nurture and never noted that there's been 20 years of research on the nature of nurture.
By the way, for the listener, I should actually explain what they found. So they showed that non-transmitted alleles can impact a child through their effects on the parents and other relatives. So there is an effect of the parental genotype that is not transmitted. So that does suggest there is this kind of role of the parents matter maybe more than you presented in your book. But you're saying...
Well, that there's GE correlation, right?
Yeah.
And do they reference this? I mean, it's like they pretend as if this research hasn't existed for a long time. It's kind of a cute little measure, and it might lead somewhere. I don't think it's explaining much variance, but let's see what happens there. But to pretend that this has suddenly discovered the nature of nurture kind of irritates me, because we've been saying this for 30 years.
So I think the interesting question is, what is the implication of that finding? And, Collinger and Hardin wrote an interesting commentary on that paper, arguing that we can use that understanding in nature to understand how parenting matters for children's education. Like, can kind of get us better at the mechanism. And they have this quote from this commentary. They say, for humans living in wealthy societies, genetic nurture might be more relevant for behavior and social achievements than for more biologically proximal outcomes, such as body size. Yeah. Do you disagree with that?
Yeah. Well, that's if it even pans out. I don't think it's explaining much variance. I remain skeptical, but if it shows that it's a true effect, fine. But it's of no power compared to an adoption design, where we can relate biological parents with their kids, and we find evidence for a lot of GE correlation. And with these designs, like parents of twin design, you can separate out passive and reactive and active types of gene-environment correlation. So, I think people are interested in this non-transmitted allele thing because it's new and it involves DNA. I don't know that fundamentally it's going to tell us very much that we don't know, and it's not very powerful.
I would have predicted that you would say that. They even say straight up in their commentary, the phenomena of genetic nurture underscores that the results of genetic association studies cannot be interpreted as support for a biologically deterministic account of human individual differences, as most social scientists who work with genetic data have stressed. How this data suggests just how tightly genetic and environmental mechanisms are entangled.
We've been talking about GE correlation. DNA doesn't do anything by itself. For me, the bottom line is, if you take inherited DNA differences and you relate that to behavior, I'm going to call that causal. I'm not saying I've explained the mechanisms, but I can tell you there's no backward causation, as there is in most correlations in psychology, where X could cause Y or Y could cause X. The behavior, the brain, the environment is not changing your inherited DNA sequence.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not disagreeing that genetics matter. What I'm trying to do is show you some papers that paint a greater nuance of the effect of the
you call that greater nuance, but
you don't think it is?
Well, why is that nuanced? We've talked about GE correlation for a long time, and I'm saying let's not have nuance. Let's have power. Let's explain behavior, and what explains behavior. Explaining behavior, individual differences in behavior from inherited DNA sequences, knowing nothing else, to me is very powerful. And then it allows us to study the nuances of GE correlation, and interaction and development, with finally having a handle on the genetic side, instead of saying, oh, it's all nuanced and complex. And we can, people use that as an argument to say, oh, we just can't really explain these things, at a mechanistic level because it's all so complicated.
I will boldly state that I think that some of these studies I have a couple more, I do think present a more nuanced picture than you do in your book. So this one...
Can you use another word than nuance?
Okay,
what are you
sure.
saying?
Can I use a word that is not offensive to your program, but adds additional data perhaps? Or actually, I would say contradicts. And let me tell you about this study, Brannigan et al., Variation in the Heritability of Educational Attainment. And this is an international meta-analysis. We find that heritability, shared environment, and unshared environment each explain a substantial percentage of the variance in attainment across all countries, and that the heritability varied by nation.
For educational achievement, there is, even in our studies, we find about 20% shared environment for educational achievement. It's interesting. We did the first study of going into university, whether you go to university or not. That shows 40% shared environmental influence. But performance in university, your scores your grades at university show very little shared environmental influence. And what I think this is about is yes, there is some shared environmental influence on educational achievement, much, much smaller than the genetic
No,
differences.
that's not what they found, though. They said for educational attainment, not only is our grand mean estimate of common environment of similar magnitude to our grand mean estimate of heritability, but in 32% of the studies in our sample, the estimated effect of common environment actually exceeds that of genetic differences.
Yeah, well, we've done the biggest study by far, and we don't find that. And we find 20%.
This is a meta-analysis.
Yeah, you say that, but there aren't many studies really on educational achievement that have sufficient power to look at these things. So I'm skeptical. And the thing to keep an eye on is intelligence. Do you accept the finding that there's shared environmental influence in childhood, but not in later life?
I do accept the conclusion that the heritability of intelligence increases as we age. Yes.
But do you accept the conclusion as well that shared environmental influences are important for intelligence in childhood, but they drop out to negligible levels in adulthood?
That does seem to be what the data suggests, yes.
And then with educational achievement, you can only study that in childhood and then university. But there's very few studies in university. I think ours is one of the only ones. And I think we're going to find the same sort of thing. I agree that there's some shared environmental influence. I don't agree that it's as much as you're saying, that it's as big as intelligence. I know you completely accept the results of a meta-analysis.
Well, what I think is interesting about this paper is it also is an international, and so it found that heritability varied significantly by nation. To me, that does suggest that if we take a broader view of cultural differences. Yeah.
No, I think that's fine. And there is some evidence that shared environmental influence is greater in the United States. And, there's papers suggesting that the reason for that is the decentralized education system, where education is allowed to maximally differ, across communities. Whereas in England, to some extent Australia, and some European countries, there are these national curricula. It's probably greatest in the UK. And so if you really have a universal education, it will cut down on environmental variation, which means genetic variation, heritability, will account for more of the variation that you see.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So that's a good point. And you talk in your book about how we can use heritability coefficients as a way of actually judging the fairness and equity of environments and opportunities. Yeah. And I am on board with that point.
Yeah. So I agree that you can find different results in different countries. And, your results have to be limited to the country you're studying. And meta-analyses are kind of good on that score. And it's an interesting possibility that shared environment's greater in the States than it is in other countries. If you look at the power, though, I don't think they can show that it's significantly different.
I think relating to that is the Timothy Bates Tucker-Draub paper, Large Cross-National Differences in Gene by Socioeconomic Status Interaction on Intelligence, finding that, in this large-scale study and studies from Western Europe and Australia, where social policies ensure more uniform access to high-quality education and healthcare, gene by SES effects were zero or reversed.
Yep. Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Well, I think when the first study was done by Turkheimer, it had absolutely no power to detect a gene-environment interaction.
Right.
The original 2013 paper.
But this paper seems to be much better.
I understand. But then the only studies that are showing this effect are Tucker-Draub or his students in the US. Most of those studies are incredibly underpowered to detect the gene-environment interaction. I've done a paper where I show that you need about 2,000 pairs of twins to get any sort of reasonable power. Those studies don't begin to approach that. So I am skeptical about it. And certainly we find, with one of the largest studies, no evidence whatsoever. We actually find an effect in the opposite direction, slightly, but not significantly. So it isn't really a meta-analysis of the world. It's a few studies in the States, from even one of the bigger studies in the States, what is it, the Vietnam study or one of those studies, don't show the effect. So I'm still a bit skeptical, and it's something, you call it nuanced. People want to find gene-environment interaction, and I'm not against it. It's just, I don't see much evidence for it in that specific topic, but more generally, all the candidate gene by environment interaction studies, journals now aren't even accepting those unless you show replication, because it's sort of like a poster child for failures to replicate. So I'm skeptical of GE interaction, and I'm puzzled why people are so keen on it.
Whereas that's what the data suggests, though.
No, I don't see that. And what I think is important is gene-environment correlation. and people don't get into that as much. That's how genes work, I think.
So also Stuart Ritchie and Tucker Drob did the huge meta-analysis showing that education has a causal effect on IQ.
Yeah.
And they say education appears the most consistent, robust, and durable method yet to be identified for raising intelligence.
Yes. And how much variance does that account for?
Approximately 1 to 5 IQ points for every additional year of education. And that has huge social implications.
But
right?
How much variance is that? Stuart Ritchie is my colleague. I've talked to him about this. And, he agrees the effect is incredibly small in terms of the variance explained in the population, because most places have compulsory schooling. You go to school for a certain number of years, right? So this is based on things where you go to extra classes and, things that are outside the normal. And, all we're talking about is what exists in the real world. There isn't much variability. I mean, the vast majority of countries around the world, they go to school compulsorily till 16 or something like that. So I don't think it's accounting for much variance. It could make a difference. That's the way I interpret it, is to say, if we had kids go to school more, maybe it could have a bigger effect. That's a could be.
It's actually an interesting point, because I've been thinking about this from a variation perspective. Well, you in the book use language such as it doesn't make a difference. Education, parenting doesn't make a difference in becoming who you are. But technically what you're saying is it doesn't make much of a difference in explaining differences in who you are. But that's like saying fish in water. If you take the water, they don't vary at all in water. But if you take the water away, the fish die. So, your statement doesn't seem to be in who you are. That's a developmental question.
No, but you're misinterpreting it. What I always say is parents' schools matter, but they don't make a difference.
They don't make a difference from an individual differences point of view.
Well, that's when I emphasize that. I have a whole chapter saying we're only talking about individual differences. We're only talking about the 1% of DNA that differs. We're only talking about things that make a difference. And I try to emphasize that's not the only perspective on things. You can talk about universals. Why is the human species a natural language user? Why do we walk on 2 feet? Why do we have frontal vision? Those universal questions are important. But I'm particularly interested in, as you are, individual differences. So I try to throw that in every now and then. It gets boring every time you say any trait to say individual differences in. But I hope I've made the case, if someone reads the book, that we're only talking about the sources of individual differences.
I was thinking, I'm going to give you a point of agreement, and I like to go back and forth between and let you know where I agree with you. I thought, and where I think you had a good point. You talked about parenting is kind of let's observe who our child is becoming, as opposed to trying to make them into something. One of my favorite psychologists, Abraham Maslow, he said we should be horticulturists. That's what parents and educators should be. And I always really liked that metaphor, as a horticulturist, right? Because you're kind of sculpting who the person is already, potentiality, and we're kind of helping them kind of become that person.
But Alice Gopnik's book, last year.
Oh, yeah.
Gardeners and carpenters, and saying parents aren't carpenters, they should be gardeners. Oh. But in my book, I even say, I'm not so sure they should be gardeners either. If by that you mean you're going to prune the plant and nurture it so that it grows to be a certain thing, like this is an iris, it's supposed to be like this. But, that's a bit of a subtlety, but I take what you're saying.
So the interesting about the mattering, when you say they do matter, you say, well, they matter in the sense that the way we treat our children really impacts who they become. If we treat them in a way that's more controlling or forced, we can actually be taking them away from their destiny in a sense. So they matter.
No, I don't think that's it at all. It's more like you were saying, water and fish. That is, you can't say water isn't important for fish because if you take it away, they die. Well, in some ways, parenting's like that. We're mammals. Infants are born altricial. Parents matter in the sense that they provide the essential ingredients physically and psychologically for kids to develop. They will die without parents,
right.
In the grossest way. But even more than that, parents are a very important relationship for kids.
Good.
But do they make a difference? And I would say no.
There's 2 different levels of analysis here, which I think gets tricky. There's the developmental level of analysis, and then there's, partitioning sources of variance. Things don't have to co-vary between people a lot in order to be important, right? I mean, obviously you would agree with that.
I don't know what you mean.
The water example was a good one. When you calculate heritability estimates, we're talking about the factors that we're controlling for the factors that vary, environmental factors.
I try to say we're only talking about variance. We're talking about differences between people and what makes the difference.
But that doesn't mean that the factors that don't show much variation, like having 5 fingers on my hand, most everyone has 5 fingers on their hand, but that actually obviously was biologically, genetically determined, even though it didn't have much variability.
Mm-hmm. Like language use and frontal vision and bipedalism. These are all basically universal characteristics, right?
Right.
So if we're not clear about that, it's really important we get clear that we're not talking about things that make us human, like the 99% of the DNA that's the same for all of us. We're talking about the things that make us different, like the 1% of DNA that differs between us. I'm not saying parents make a difference. I'm saying parents matter, but they don't make a difference. They don't make kids.
You don't think they make a difference when it comes to things that we don't necessarily just sending us to a school that doesn't have a roof that's about to fall down on the children's heads? I mean, doesn't that make a difference?
Yeah, if it made a difference, it ought to account for variance. And what I see with the high heritabilities, especially in England, is maybe it's telling us that schools are probably good enough. They're allowing most kids to do their thing. If some schools were particularly terrible and some were particularly great, we'd expect that environmental variation to account for a lot of variance. And as I say, in England, where we have these excellent on-site evaluations of schools, those ratings don't correlate with school achievement. And you think of things like class size, right? How much variance does class size explain? Very, very little, 1%. So it's always plausible to think that these things make a difference. I think they matter a lot. You want kids to go to schools that have roofs, more than that don't have bullying, that have good teachers. You want schools to be a good place for kids to be, but not because the kids who get the better ones of those, the better schools or whatever, that they're going to do better at these things. It's the difference between means and variance, I guess.
I totally get what you're saying. Yeah, I totally get what you're saying. I'm trying to think of how, even if you're right, let's say that a child has a proclivity to be very genetically to soak up knowledge like a sponge. How could it not matter that you have a teacher or a school system that is more likely to challenge and advance and accelerate that student? That's what I don't understand.
Well, because I think it's mostly self-driven. It's a difference between instruction and education. Instruction really means you shove it into the kid. And that's the way a lot of people think about education. Whereas from this genetics of experience perspective, I really think of education as education, which means to educare, to lead out rather than
draw
shove
out.
it.
To draw out.
So you give kids the resources, the possibilities for doing their thing, for learning what they want to learn. And that's why I'm really excited about the possibility of personalized education and the potential that computers offer. You see that with math now. Kids can, with adaptive learning, they can go as far and as fast as they want. And the kids who don't do so well, who are slower at it, they can learn math without failing a lot along the way. In contrast to our current system, where you get a teacher in front of a classroom, boring half the kids, and over the heads of the other half of the kids. People in education get so upset by this, but God, it makes such good sense to me. Free the teachers up from this sorts of, stand and deliver sorts of lectures, and let them help the kids who need more help. Or, as seems to be the case in education, spend time with its behavioral problems are as big a thing in the schools as the actual learning process. So I kind of went far away from, I think, your initial point.
No, and I agree about, I think personalized learning is important, but I think that actually is consistent with my point that, teachers can make a difference, maybe just in a different way than people ordinarily think of. And also, there are lots of ways that we think they could make a difference where they don't, and science can inform that. Learning styles training has been shown to be pretty bunk, right? Yeah. So anyway, I'll move on, and I'm going to put all these papers. And I hope that, by the way, I hope this generates a good discussion. I certainly don't have the answers. I wanted to openly discuss this fascinating data with you.
It's kind of interesting that, I'm interested in the comments that come up as well, because we've done, what do they call it? A discourse analysis of the comments that have come up from the dozen things like, media presentations and stuff. And what you end up realizing, it seems totally clear when you look at these, like we had a thing in the Daily Mail and something in the Guardian. These are, the major papers in the United Kingdom. And some of these had 1,000 comments, that sort of thing. It's so much a function of the context of whether the guy who writes it is writing kind of a balanced piece or writing, kind of an extreme view, and also where it's published. And, so in the better places, you find that the comments are really, very interesting. But the ones from the less good places, they're not even worth looking at. They're just arguing against each, in a really nasty way, So that's why I'm keen to look at your comments, because I think people, listen to your sorts of blogs because they're genuinely interested. They're not fanatics pushing one view or the other.
I hope that's the case.
So I really look forward to the comments.
Me too. So what about the very recent study I thought was interesting? Maybe you don't think it's as interesting as I did. Daniel Belsky, genetic analysis of social class mobility in 5 longitudinal studies. I mean, we're talking about pretty well. I'm only reading to you studies that are like either meta-analyses or longitudinal across multiple samples. And they said, we tested if education-linked polygenic scores predicted social mobility in greater than 20,000 individuals in 5 longitudinal studies in the United States, Britain, and New Zealand. Participants with higher polygenic scores achieved more education and career success and accumulated more wealth. However, they also tended to come from better-off families. And this is the key test. In the key test, participants with higher polygenic scores tended to be upwardly mobile compared with their parents. Moreover, in sibling difference analysis, the sibling with a higher polygenic score was more upwardly mobile. Thus, education genome-wide association discoveries are not mere correlates of privilege. They influence social mobility within a life. Education GWAS discoveries affect socioeconomic attainment through influence on individuals' family of origin environments and their social mobility. To me, that is quite a nuanced study, don't you think?
Well, I'm glad you think so, because the first study and the one in the UK is our study.
Oh, yay!
Yeah. Okay. And so what we showed is that you can define this as social mobility just in terms of educational intergenerational transmission, they call it. And so you can get kids who have parents who go to university or not. And then some of the university educated parents, the kids don't go to university, right, and some do. And similarly, with the parents who are uneducated, didn't go to university, some of the kids go to university and some don't. So we looked at the polygenic scores of these kids. And what you find, of course, is that the university educated parents, their children have higher polygenic scores substantially on this EA, educational attainment polygenic score. But what was really interesting, I thought, was that you can look at downward social mobility, look at the kids who didn't go to university, whose parents did. Their polygenic scores are right in the middle of the other two groups. And similarly, the kids whose parents were not university educated, who went to university, had non-significantly different scores. So you got, they're in the middle. And what I like about that is to point out to people that social mobility isn't just upward social mobility, it's downward social mobility as well, mm-hmm, which is really important. So I agree completely because, I think we did the first study of that sort.
Very cool. And I agree with Paige Hardin's conclusion on this, that this shows that by controlling for genetics, scientists can more clearly see that our fate in life is largely determined by how much money our parents have. You can take people with the same exact polygenic scores and show, that one person can have a much harder time getting rich as an adult when they're born in a lower class family than someone with the same exact score who was born in a higher social class. I mean, don't you think that is relevant?
Yeah, absolutely right. That was the point of what we were trying to say. But I think it also ties in with something I think is important if people are understanding all of this, to say, I think heritability is an index of social mobility, educational opportunity. Because if you get rid of the environmental differences like privilege and wealth, you're left with the genetic differences. And it's also a reason why I think we don't have to worry about genetic castes. First of all, half of the variance is not genetic. And I think most of that is non-shared, which I think is essentially random and stochastic. And that there should be downward social mobility as well as upward social mobility, So anyway, it raises a lot of big issues to talk about.
Yeah.
But I'm really keen on doing this sort of work. My twins now, this twin study of 10,000 pairs of twins that I studied began when they were born in 1994 to 96. they're now in their 20s. And I'm really keen we have DNA on those as well. So we're really keen to ask these sorts of questions about not just university education, but what about emerging adulthood and how people sort themselves out in life? Because we don't know much about it now. We've got this period from 20 to 30. It used to be like, Bruce Springsteen said, after school, high school, you get married, have kids, get a job for life, end of story. But boy, it isn't like that anymore.
Yeah. Good. And I'm curious about everything, so I'm very curious what you find in this further research. So I'm going to end here with one last major point. So this idea of going with the grain, in large, I agree with this idea, that to me, like one of the biggest factors in positive psychology research predicting life satisfaction is just simply self-acceptance, right? So this seems to dovetail nicely in a way with your message. However, some things we don't want to go the grain against. And I think the big question and some reaction from your book is, what is that wiggle room that we can have to change the parts of our personality and that we don't like? And I came across this Brent Roberts meta-analysis, a systematic review of personality trait change through intervention, that does show that there are things like therapy matters, Therapy makes a difference, in fact. It doesn't just matter. It makes a difference in our personality traits. Anxiety disorders shows the largest effects. Emotional stability can be influenced. So I just want to end here with a message as well that I think your book does show that DNA matters, but I think all this kind of emerging research shows it's not everything, right?
Absolutely. And, I've tried to emphasize that in the book, that we're talking about things that make a difference now. That's what is. We're describing what is. You're talking about what could be. And there's no necessary relationship between the two. So I have a very high polygenic score for body mass index. And if you could see, I've also got a belly to go with that a bit. I'm
do that again and I'll take a screen capture.
which is moderately obese. But knowing that I have this even higher 94th percentile polygenic score, it doesn't say, oh, I give up, I'm a genetic fatty. It actually is motivating. I say, I'm not doing too bad at the 70th percentile, but it also means I've got a lifelong battle. It's not just losing the 6 pounds I gained last Christmas. I've got a constant battle. I put on weight more easily than other people. I don't lose it as well. And I need to control my environment so that I lose weight. So if that matters to me, I can lose more weight, And so I agree completely that it doesn't mean you can't change. And in some ways, I think it might help you with some of these changes. So I agree completely that you can change behavior. And maybe we all need to be doing CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, as a prophylactic.
And, meditation has been shown to, I think that meditation actually affects that pull of our genes and gives us kind of a space between that pull and our action.
Yeah, it's probably good for everyone. But if you knew that you were particularly vulnerable to stress or whatever, maybe that would motivate. We all know you're supposed to eat well and sleep well and exercise and be mindful. But, we'll get around to it sometime. You just don't actually do it. But maybe knowing about the genetics could actually help you say, I really ought to do this.
Thank you, Robert. We'll end there. I know that we had some hairy, contentious moments in this chat. But
Not at all. It was great. Yeah. I mean, this is nothing, Scott. I think it bothers you more than it bothers me.
Well, no, I love having I love this too.
Someone who's knowledgeable. What I don't like are these media interviews where people don't know anything. So it's wonderful talking to someone who's so knowledgeable about this stuff. I would like to say, though, if you get a lot of comments, maybe we can have a follow-up conversation.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. The rest of the statement I wanted to say, though, is despite some potentially contentious moments, I want you to really know that I respect your work immensely, and it has influenced my own work in intelligence. And as we move forward, I'm glad that you're opening up these conversations, because I really do think we need to have very honest conversations about the potential implications of this data that's going to come out. You're right, it's going to come out either way. So thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Well, thank you. It was really terrific talking to you, Scott.
Likewise.
I hope we do it again, yeah?
Likewise. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for listening to the Psychology Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in the discussion at thepsychologypodcast.com. That's thepsychologypodcast.com. Also, please add a rating and review of the Psychology Podcast on iTunes. Thanks for being such a great supporter of the podcast, and tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.